Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and we're going to be covering things in the realm of sex in this particular podcast. I'm going to talk about safe sex, being healthy, making good choices. That seems a bit cliche, but we can't overemphasize that because sex in and of itself is a very vulnerable place to be. And you're sharing something with your partner, and what you want to do is you want to share good sex, you want to share good health, you don't want to share sicknesses and viruses and things. So using contraceptives, those tend to prevent unwanted pregnancies, but covering up, I'm talking about for guys, it's wearing condoms, and there's also to help prevent the transmission of certain types of diseases. We're talking AIDS is one. Though we've come a long way in dealing with, in a medical sense, we've come a long way in dealing with these kinds of things. It was interesting to note that there are, especially amongst young people, types of chlamydia. Things are back on the rise. I've read this. And why is that? And I think it's because we, as young people, we have gotten very comfortable with letting modern medicine solve our problems rather than the wisdom of using contraceptives, knowing and plus knowing something about the partner that you're with. And there's obviously only so much you can know about a stranger when they are new to you. If they don't reveal things to you, then you're not going to know. But when you've been with a person a while, you kind of get some idea. You know where they've been. At least you hope you know where they've been, and you hope they've been communicating with you if they have additional partners. Again, I'm not here to be preachy. I don't say you have to be monogamous. That is really an agreement that you make with your partner as to how many partners you have. The thing is, it's generally a lot safer when you are monogamous because that way, once you've established your baseline, I mean, you've gone to the doctor, you know that your AIDS test is clear, you know that you don't have chlamydia or gonorrhea or a number of other sexually transmitted diseases, and these are sexually transmitted diseases, and there's another one that's trichomonas, then you can use that as your baseline, and you're safe. You can have protected or unprotected sex at that point, and a lot of times that will depend upon whether you are looking to prevent unwanted pregnancies, between the partners. Now, there's an interesting thing that is being tested for men, birth control, which are not necessarily the contraceptives like condoms, but it is actually a pill. And I'll be doing some research to find out about that, but I just heard about that recently, say within the last couple of months, and I find it fascinating. It is something that is not proven yet to work. I believe it is still in the trial phase, but once something like that becomes available, it'll be a lot easier for one to use that rather than, say, stopping the action and then putting on a condom. And so for those who are really impulsive, and let's say if you don't have a condom with you, if you're on some sort of birth control, like a pill, man or woman, then it makes the freedom to be sexually intimate a lot less risky. And I'm going to approach it from that direction. Something else to consider too, and this is between men and women obviously approach sex from a thought process. They approach it a lot differently. And demystifying some of these conversations, I'd like to do that whenever possible. And I'm not at all advocating that there is a right way and a wrong way, but the perceptions and the miscommunication that happens in a relationship in general, and then when it happens in sex, it could certainly have a very detrimental effect. Why? Because there's a lot of vulnerability around this particular area. And in getting your sexual needs, there is a lot of vulnerability in asking, and then having a misunderstanding or miscommunication. You can see how it becomes exponential. So here's a fairly common one. It's, and I've had women ask me, what is it that men want with sex? What is it? Why do men approach sex as though it's the only thing that's on their mind? Because a lot of times it is the only thing that's on their mind. And until they get to a place in their development that there are lots of other things that you can do with women, they're going to be singly focused. So what happens is it becomes incumbent upon you to do a selection process. If you are interested in a guy who's a little more well-rounded, then choose a guy who can display that romance, that interest in other things, rather than somebody that's going to be only interested in sex. Because if you're worried about getting used, and I'm sure you'll communicate that, then it's like guys who are in that frame of mind. If they want sex, then they're going to be driven to at least try to convince you, oh, no, that's not the only thing I want. But to add, not all guys are like that. Some guys are just plain clumsy. And they're just plain clumsy. And what can I say other than, you're going to have to decide when you're with a guy and you are thinking about sex, how experienced is he? And you know what? That's kind of a double-edged sword, because some guys are very experienced, and you're probably going to wonder, how many women has this guy done? And it's kind of the same thing with women. They think about it. How many, guys will wonder, wow, this girl's got a lot of skills. I mean, how many guys has she been with? Well, you know what? You kind of find those things out in the conversation before you become before you become sexual, because there's a lot to be discovered about a person and their past. And you do kind of want a case history, because you want to know who you are with. And by that, consider it this way. Every partner that they've been with, you're going to have been with that partner too. And so on, and so on, and so on. So asking questions before the sex starts is going to give you a lot of information that you need. And, I look them in the eye. Ask the questions, because if you don't, because a lot of people aren't going to speak up. A lot of people aren't just going to tell you their past, and because of the vulnerability, because, people are afraid of being judged. And, there's some things in people's past, if they've had an STD, how many people are going to be honest about that? I know a lot of them that would be, but a lot of people won't. They'll hide that. And certainly if there is no, let's say, residual, let's say they had chlamydia or gonorrhea or something, you can take a pill, you can get rid of that. But if they've had genital warts, let's say they contracted that from a partner, that's something that you can't hide, because oftentimes people, for whatever reason, they're going to have a flare up, and, how are you going to hide that from your partner? So if you know those kinds of, you have to know to ask those kinds of questions and expect a response. Because the thing to do in a case like that is you don't have sex when there's an outbreak, because then you're just going to spread it. And if you're a person that doesn't have it, you definitely don't want it, because once you get it, then you've got it. But here's something to say, that when people have an outbreak, it is not an indictment of whether they're promiscuous or anything like that, because most people have it. And they don't know. Just ask your doctor. It is something that is very prevalent, but it is something that the immune system generally keeps in check. And oftentimes when the body gets stressed, then because these things are buried in the nerves in the body, when the body gets stressed, then these things tend to come out. And I'm just describing it. The biology of it is something we can get into at another time. But it's very important with your sexual partner that you are in communication about those things. Let's not be bashful, because remember, we're here to enjoy it. We don't want to have something that's going to have some sort of residual effect, and then us be resentful, because I guarantee when it comes up and you feel like you've been blindsided by something like that, that's when the drama starts. And you generally don't want drama when it comes to sex. You want to enjoy it. I'm going to take a break, and I'll be right back.
What movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. Ladies, let's face it, guys are always talking about the size of their male member. I'm talking about the size of their penis. Guys have talked about that since the beginning. They worry about that. And, to the guys that are listening, of the women that I've talked to about it, they say they really don't care. What they like is that you're interested, that you're concerned about them, and that you enjoy being sexual with them. And there's a lot of things that go on in terms of the sex chemistry that has nothing to do with the size of your member. Okay, but now back to the women. So here's what I'm talking about. Guys are very insecure about that particular thing. Some guys are very secure about it because they feel like they've got a big member and they can handle anything that comes along. And men do hear about women who say the bigger the better. So for guys to ask you that question, it may just become very perplexing, because every guy you have dated has probably asked you that very same question. Interestingly enough, isn't it? Guys who seem to be very confident, very masculine, would venture to ask, well, am I big enough? And that is just something that men do. So just accept it and be willing to answer the question from your perspective. It isn't, I don't think you need to go into a whole lot of detail about guys that you've dated in the past, and in the interest of just being able to move the conversation along, I don't think you should talk about other men with respect to how big they were or something like that, because it just distracts a guy, and it doesn't necessarily lead to sexual pleasure. It's just merely a conversation, but to reassure him that he is adequate. And I think that's really where the conversation should go. Just reassure him that he's adequate. And on the basis of that, there's a lot of information out there about what size is average. And I'm telling you, when you read the statistics, when you read the information, you find it is a very small difference in the length of a man's penis in most cases, from what you consider average to what you consider large. I can go into a lot of other details later in terms of numbers, but it's just the average male penis is a little less than 7 inches. Okay, that's average. So when guys get a little intimidated by the fact that they hear about men who are much larger, you understand that for a lot of men, their experience of sex really happens there's a lot of there's a lot of chatter, there's locker room talk, but a lot of guys get their information from porn movies. And to explain, porn, that's theater, okay? That's theatrical. And in the interest of theater, there's a lot of hype. There's stories that are created around it, and guys audition for parts like that, and they select the guy that's got the largest member because why? It shows up on camera. And it's more of an extraordinary kind of thing, so they're going to pick a guy that's larger because it works. It's theater. So to the guy out there who's listening to this, who's worried about because he doesn't match the guy that's in the movie, remember, the average woman isn't necessarily looking at porn to find a guy that's like that. It's entertainment. And for what it's worth, as long as you remember it in that context and to not be intimidated about who you are, I guarantee as a guy, you can make more of an impression on a woman when you're interested in her, when you know how to please a woman, which is understanding where her clitoris is and being interested in pleasing her that way, asking her what she likes and not being Mr. Minuteman. And by that meaning you just wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. We've heard that over and over again, but I have to emphasize that because a lot of times men have sex the way they do. I mean, they're obviously excited to be there, but sometimes they're really terribly inexperienced. And they've done it the way they've done it for so long, and they just do it wrong. So as a woman, and I'm talking to the women now, you may have to slow your guy down, and you may have to give him some pointers. And the purpose of that isn't to embarrass him, but really the purpose of that is so that you also are in conversation about what you need and what you want. Because guys will pretend like they know it all. And unfortunately, a lot of them don't know nearly enough. And there really is ample opportunity for them to do quote unquote research. There's lots of information out there. But for the sake of conversation, for the sake of the sexual relationship, for coaching your lover along, be vocal, be verbal, share what it is you need, what your needs are, what you want. And, it'll go a long way to help in the sexual relationship. Because, like I said, a lot of guys are afraid to ask. They're afraid to show that they don't know the answers because guys are expected to know all of these things. And it takes a little more time to do that kind of thing rather than just be impulsive and just run after it and just do things without knowing each other, without knowing one's history, without knowing one's experience. I can testify to the fact that having conversations about sex is very interesting, especially with a new partner, and you're kind of feeling each other out, and oftentimes the conversations tend to dwell onto that subject, and far be it from me to say that you don't want it to get stuck there because it sounds like you have a one-track mind, but it's very interesting, it's titillating, and we've always had an interest in it. I don't care who you are, whether you're young and you haven't had a lot of experience, or whether you're older and you have had a lot of experience. It's an aspect of being a human being that we can enjoy, we can appreciate, because as human beings, we have that to enjoy. See, animals, and I'm using the contrast here, animals have sex because they're into procreation, because they're instinctively driven to be sexual. Human beings, on the other hand, can actually enjoy sex because they choose to. And that's how we're wired as human beings. And when you think of it from that aspect, then you also know that because you can enjoy it, your partner can enjoy it. And now, by taking the time to think about it that way, then you can create quite a ritual around your sexual life. I want nothing more than for you to be happy with your partner. And I'm going to tell you, it's great exercise. So do that. I'm going to take a break for a commercial, and I'll be right back.
Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Well, hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. Now, here's something that can really be thorny, and it's the idea of a lubrication. Now, obviously, lubrication is important. And from the guy's standpoint, we understand that women need lubrication, because if we don't, then it becomes, there's too much friction, and it, rubs the skin raw, and that's not necessarily pleasurable. From the guy's standpoint, having a little bit of friction, that's what helps you feel the action, and that's erotic. So, you know what, and I'm talking about this because if you haven't thought about it, then, there could be something in the way of, mismatched desires, because if it doesn't feel good, then you're not going to want to do it. So for women, they need the lubrication because, for one, it helps with keeping things from being too dried out. And for guys, here's something you need to think about. When a woman is well lubricated, it really comes across, from her standpoint, it's an arousal thing. And the more arousal she has, the more lubricated she's going to be. And sometimes it works exceptionally well. She's exceptionally aroused. But then you have the part about, for the guy, well, it's kind of too slippery. And, what are we going to do about that? Well, that can be, now we have something in terms of, the pleasure is not going to be the same for both. Well, one of the things you might do to kind of bridge that gap is you might as a guy, you might withdraw for a little bit and then kind of tease around the edge a little bit and then reinsert. That works too. It works to kind of prolong the sexual, the play back and forth. But it also helps with that, what to do with the excess lubrication. That works for a while, because one of the things that you don't want is you don't want your partner to be too dried out, because that's going to be painful. And I'm talking about for the woman. And as for guys, it can be very difficult to even get inserted into a woman if she's too dry, because now you have, that resistance to want to even be inserted. So that can be a drop in the action, you see. So you're going to have to work with your partner and find a common ground there. Now, here's something that I actually had a couple of notes. And what I wanted to mention is, in the first segment, I talked about safe sex, and birth control was one of the topics that I brought up. And one of the ways in which we can have birth control, at least for women, it is the IUD, the intrauterine device. And basically what it is, it's a device that's placed in the opening in the cervix, and it prevents the male semen from getting through and then into the ovaries, which then mixes with the egg, and there you go. Then you have procreation. So the purpose like I said, it's to prevent pregnancy, but there are other uses for the IUD. It can also be part of hormone replacement therapy, and it's a different way of administering the drug, the medication. So for guys, if you happen to be having sex and you might feel something in the way of like a little pinprick right on the very tip of your penis, that is probably what you run into. Now, oftentimes women don't even realize that a guy could either reach that far into them or even experience that. So if you do, that's probably what it is. And women, if you happen to have an IUD, then it might be helpful to let your partner know, because here's the thought. If a guy's wearing a condom and you have an IUD and there's just enough of it there that he might interfere with it, it might run into it, it could rip the condom. And for the safe sex part of this, and that's kind of one of the other reasons why I'm bringing this up, if there's a breach in the condom, then it could allow something, you're no longer fully protected. So that's the thought. I've even known people who use 2 condoms. It's really safe sex. I think one of the reasons some people don't use condoms is because you can't feel it as much. It has to do with practice, and some people are more comfortable with it because, there's the mental part of this too. So think of it from that side. But back to the intrauterine device and what guys may feel, and when you're also thinking about safe sex. Guys, if you're wearing a condom and a woman has an intrauterine device, there is a possibility. There is a possibility that you may strike that device and it may cause a little bit of a tear. So now we may breach the condom and it may not be as safe. So there's spermicides, which help with protection. And so that, and I'm saying this because I want you to be thinking about this in your conversation when you are being sexual with your partner. Because like I said, I've had notes, and I wanted to mention that, at least mention that in this podcast, and I may talk about it some more a little bit later on. But, and one other thing I wanted to cover in terms of being sexual, and I kind of launched into this because I was initially talking about how men may be uncomfortable with the size of their male member, and from there, women don't seem to really have much of a problem with size. They would rather be much more aroused, and the man's skill in doing that makes up for a lot of things. Let me tell you, makes up for a lot of things. And then going the direction of why men are more concerned with their penis, the size of that, rather than their technique, it's because guys oftentimes learn about sex through movies, through porn. And what I have to emphasize is that's theater. There are a lot of things in theater that are exaggerated for the point of at least displaying an idea, getting that idea across, and then they go on to the next line. And that's visual. That's a visual medium. So in order to do that, sometimes you have to have something that's unusually large so that it can be seen, whether on film and on the television screen or in the theater, wherever you see it. But just so that you guys know, that the guys that are performing, those are like athletes. Everybody that goes onto the football field doesn't make the team. Those guys have to go through tryouts, and they want the biggest and the best to play at their positions. It's the same thing with porn movies. They want the biggest and the best because it's about entertainment, and understanding that distinction, realize you don't have to match that as far as women are concerned. Women will tell you time and time and time again, that's not the standard you need to meet. The standard that you need to meet is you need to be intelligent about how to pleasure a woman, about being attentive, about being kind. And you'll find the size of your member doesn't matter. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this podcast with that. I want to thank you for joining me. Feel free to join me on my next podcast. This is John Johnson, and this is the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.